Hello, everyone. I'm Athrea Mothur, the Judith Bresler Fellow at the Center for Art Law. To those of you joining in for the first time, welcome to the Estate Leader series on legacies and futures of artists. To those of you returning for the series, welcome back and welcome to our next session. Last week, we had Yayoi Shinori speak to us about copyright strategies for estates, and today we have our second speaker, who I'll introduce shortly, speaking to us about legacy planning with living artists. Before that, let me give you a little snapshot of our organization. We're a Brooklyn-based research and education nonprofit. We're dedicated to offering resources and programming for the advancement of a vibrant arts and law community. Through our website, our newsletter, events, we disseminate information, and we try to keep our audience updated on all art law related news, programs, events, publications, and a lot more. The center also facilitates conversations by hosting and participating in programs like ours today. And honestly, this doesn't even begin to explain everything that we do. So we invite you to subscribe to our newsletter in case you haven't already to receive updates. We also invite you to visit our website, it's artlaw.org, and our social media at Center for Art Law. On our Instagram, we also additionally post our visits to some really exciting museums and immersive art experiences, so you may want to check that out as well. You also may consider becoming a premium member, and if you can, make a donation to support our efforts in making art law accessible to all. For our upcoming events, we have a ton of exciting ones, including a workshop on copyright, which teaches the practicalities and even how to register a copyright. We have our second session in our Some Like It Digital series, and more will be coming on that soon. We also have a session on lawyers who are artists and the creation of virtual galleries during a pandemic. We have our visual artist immigration clinic scheduled for November 9th, and we have our estate planning clinic in December. We'll send across the details through our newsletter, and you can even check out the events on our website soon. Our speakers for the series, we had Yayoi last week. Today we have Tracy, and for the following Thursdays, we'll have Julia and we'll have Chelsea. Irina, the founder of the center, she moderated last week's session, and we have our executive director with us today, Manelli, who'll be taking over next week. And for today's session, you have me. A few of our housekeeping items. This program, it is going to be recorded for archival purposes. Feel free to turn off your camera, though we'd love to see you. And everyone will be muted except for the panelists throughout the program. So if you have any questions, we really encourage active participation. Please ask them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be monitoring the chat and sending links to relevant articles and cases throughout the discussion. Also, a link to the handout with the bios and the reading material, it'll be placed in the chat box soon as well, and you'll have the ability to download them after you fill out a brief survey that we'll send to you at the end of the event. We really appreciate you filling out the survey because the results, they allow us to bring together more of these events and bring more speakers who will be of interest to you. Now, finally, let me introduce our speaker for today, Tracy Bartley. She is the director of the R.B. Kitai Estate. She holds degrees in painting and in art conversation. She worked as the studio manager for Kitai from 1998 to 2007, and upon his death was named as the director of the R.B. Kitai Estate. In 2015, she also founded the nonprofit R.B. Kitai Studio Project. And with experience in estate planning, studio management, and the formation and operation of artist-endowed foundations, she currently consults with artists and estates around the issues of legacy. We're all so excited to hear from you, Tracy. And now finally, let me hand over the floor and the Zoom screen to you. Thank you.
Unmuted here. All right. Good morning. You can hear me okay? Right. Good morning from Los Angeles. Thank you so much to the Center for Art Law for providing this opportunity for sharing a little bit about the work I do. And I'm grateful to my colleagues who have joined me in this series. As mentioned, my name is Tracy Bartley, and I'm director of the R.B. Kitai Studio Project, the nonprofit that supports the R.B. Kitai estate. We're here in Los Angeles, where Kitai spent his last years. Today, my seminar will cover some practical aspects of legacy planning, and I know my colleagues will be covering other topics in the upcoming sessions, as Yayoi already did with an excellent presentation around copyright issues last week. I am going to focus on my approach to working with living artists and discussing considerations for their legacy plan. I'm going more wide than deep today. Each component could be a presentation in itself, and I encourage you to seek out resources for more in-depth information, which will be included on the reading list that's being shared. And I'll share some more at the end as well. For some context, I worked with the painter R.B. Kittai as a studio manager for the last decade of his life in Los Angeles, and was able to do much of the groundwork that later became his estate plan. I have a background in studio art, painting conservation, and appraisal services, and I'm not a lawyer nor an accountant, and this presentation should not be taken as legal or tax advice. I first met Kittai when I invited him to speak at a conference at the Getty Conservation Institute I was organizing entitled Mortality, Immortality, the Legacy of 20th Century Art. And the idea was, from a conservation standpoint, to be looking at the issues that surrounded maintaining art and following the concept of artist intent. Today, I will use my experience working with Kittai and managing the art portion of his estate to frame the considerations I present to living artists formulating a legacy plan. A little bit on Kittai. Kittai was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1932. He was an American artist who spent the bulk of his career living and working in London. He is considered a member of the School of London, a term he coined famously in an essay for the exhibition of figurative work by British artists that he curated for the Art Council of Great Britain in 1976, entitled The Human Clay. He was a figurative painter, well known for his work in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and a master draftsman. There was a retrospective of his work organized by the Tate in 1994 that traveled to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. His work is held in private collections and major museums around the world. He moved from London to Los Angeles in 1997, following the death of his wife, the painter Sandra Fisher. And Los Angeles had always felt like a second home to him. He had taught at UCLA in the 70s. His closest friend, David Hockney, was living here, and his eldest son and daughter had both settled nearby. Upon his death in 2007, I was named director of his estate, working with his heirs, who were the executors. I've witnessed the transformation from an active studio practice to an estate with limited financial resources and a finite plan, and an affiliated nonprofit that is working to share knowledge around legacy planning in a cooperative model and provide support to entities looking to sunset. And I'll explain the term sunset a little later on. Aside from the Kittai estate, I now work with a range of artists, from commercially successful to those who are virtually unknown, short-term and long-term. Most of my work lands with artists somewhere in the middle. And if I had to define this group, I'd probably say mid-range or mid-level, or use phrases like not highly commercially successful, but historically important in our community, or highly motivated to organize their legacy for future discovery. These are not artists who would be likely to form their own foundation upon their death to promote their work, but rather are looking for a means to organize and plan to have a solid representation of their career in place for whatever art history may hold, without putting undue burden on their heirs. I like to think that art history doesn't just remember those artists with the biggest bank accounts, and that the work we do now may lay the foundation for future scholarship and discovery. Legacy work can be expensive, and we are not deciding who is worthy of being remembered. I try to find cost-effective ways for every artist that comes to me to have some plan in place they are comfortable with. And I keep in mind always that we need to be responsible and we need to be reasonable. Last week, Yayoi mentioned 3 pillars to perform legacy work under: current market, if any, current art historical or art critical reception, an artistic practice, and artist intent. The first two are quite self-explanatory, and the third I look at as the how of artist legacy. How do they want to be remembered? Are there special instructions to guide how they want to be remembered? Are there specific ways they want their work to be shared or not to be shared? How do they want it displayed? Is it to be sold? Can more work be produced? How do they want it reproduced? Is it meant to last forever? Are there conservation issues that need to be considered? And so on. What is most important in the artist's mind to have remain? How do they want to be defined? I'll stretch out here the idea too of current. I have had close and often very personal relationships with artists I work with, and the art market and art critical reception, as we know, can be fickle. I like to add in the questions, was the artist an important mentor or teacher to a significant group of established artists? Was the artist a participant in an important but perhaps under-recognized movement? Does the artist simply want a time capsule available for the future? What was their context within the artistic community? I'm including this image of this 1986 Art News cover of Kittai. As usual, he was stirring up trouble. And he'd like to remind me that you can go into a used bookstore and see a stack of old art magazines with images on the cover and not know who these people are anymore. Their names aren't remembered. There are so many artists who have achieved great success during their lifetime who aren't considered important today. And there are so many artists who had no attention given to them during their lifetime and now set records at auction. I try to keep this in mind. My final big question, my main consideration is how can an artist leave a plan that is affordable, brings them peace of mind, and is a reasonable and again, responsible ask of their heirs? And I know these are the hard questions. Share a little bit about my slides going forward. They're all images from Kittai's Los Angeles home and studio, and were captured the week after his death by suicide. We realized quite quickly that the house was to be sold and understood the importance of documenting everything as it stood. Kittai used his entire house as a studio. This image is of the garage that had been converted as a painting studio, but you'll see images throughout the house, and everywhere it's art and books. An estate is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as all of the money and property owned by a particular person, especially at death. Estate plans are comprehensive and can include power of attorney, health directives, et cetera, and I'm not going to be covering any of that under the umbrella of legacy planning. When we talk about an artist's estate, we tend to think of art holdings in particular that remain with an artist upon their death. This can also include archival material, libraries, personal art collections, as well as art supplies and furniture pertaining to the artist's studio and practice. In some cases, it can include real estate, the artist's physical studio space. And in an ideal world, it includes liquid assets that are set aside that support the legacy work, which can include paying for storage, transport, handling, staffing if needed, and for appraisal, accounting, and legal expenses that may be accrued after death, amongst other costs. In my experience, artist estates are often artwork rich and cash poor. More often than not, I am approached by artists who are working to create or update a living trust and comprehensive estate plan. They're usually late or in their career, and these considerations have become more and more important. These are the easiest situations. I encourage friends and family who want to broach these conversations with living artists to do so carefully. It can be tricky. Legacy is tied to death, and death is a tough subject to talk about. I just read that only about 30% of Americans have up-to-date estate plans, and even less have discussed these plans with their families. And as we know, family can be complicated, and artists' families are no different, sometimes even more complicated. I encourage family members and friends of artists to come to this subject gently, with an emphasis on this opportunity for the artist to shape their own legacy, as well as the gift that organization gives to heirs. Legacy is defined in the dictionary as a situation that exists because of events, actions, etc., that took place in the past. The plan is the action. Legacy planning is the opportunity for the artist to have a say in how they are remembered. This alone is generally a strong incentive to take this work on. And so you now, or you are an artist keen to develop an estate plan that includes legacy. What does that look like? When we talk about legacy planning, it's pretty much agreed that the number one step, the very, very, very first thing to do is to understand what you have and where it is. Whether the work is all in the possession of the artist or consigned to galleries around the world, this is the most valuable piece of information to pull together. Depending on the structure of the estate and the size and scope of the holdings, estate taxes may be triggered and this inventory will prove invaluable. It's also the most important tool for the heirs. To move forward without an inventory is extremely challenging and can be very overwhelming. And so I like to begin here with the studio inventory. Sometimes this already exists as notebooks, old school card files, spreadsheets, and more so as databases housed on computers or on external hard drives or at a growing number to cloud-based storage. Sometimes though, you are starting from scratch. As far as guidelines, in the 90s, the Getty developed standards for documenting artwork known as object ID. And I encourage the system to be used as much as possible, whatever the framework you're putting it into. It is generally accepted as the minimum documentation used by appraisers. And you can find online on the Getty site a book that outlines this, and a quick Google search will also give you lots of information. Quite honestly, every recording system has its pros and cons. The most important thing is that it is thorough and up to date. It should include every artwork in their personal holdings, as well as any work they have on loan or consignment to a dealer, museum, organization, or friend. What will be included in their estate? If possible, it is nice to include an image, but it's not always so if you're working off a spreadsheet, such as Excel or Google, that aren't image friendly. But a spreadsheet is still a good place to start. And you can match up numberings and titles to image files separately. And these are often easy to upload to a database system at a later date. It is also great to include any artwork that's been sold or gifted. And if you have access to sales records, pricing. If working on a computer house database system, consider how this will be kept up to date, because I have had calls from heirs who have discovered a database with outdated software that they are no longer able to access, and we've had to pull in other forces to help retrieve the data. Many proprietary systems are moving to subscription services and cloud-based storage that does alleviate some of these problems, but always consider means of backing up your data, as well as any image files to an external hard drive. If you're computer savvy or can afford a developer, working with FileMaker Pro to customize a system is also a nice option. There's still a lot of work being done around the issue of preserving digital materials. I work with organizations that still print out emails to keep in their archive. And I hope that cloud-based systems are offering a solution, but I am never without fear of obsolescence, and you can never back up too frequently. At the end of the day, a hard copy may be the most secure means of managing inventory. I am currently working with an artist who is self-publishing a book of his work, including the most pertinent information, title, material, dimensions, location, alongside an image as his record of his estate holdings. And it may sound like overkill, but we keep a copy of every database entry of Kitai's work, housed in a series of binders as part of his archive. Along with the computer entries, we try and keep this as up to date as possible with sales, exhibition, and publication information, but I know that this is not sustainable. This is also where we keep copies of much of our archival material surrounding specific works, correspondence from collectors, unpublished writing by Kitai and work, source material that came into the creation of the work, etc., that eventually we hope to scan and include in our database. So whether it's a notebook with careful entries or a state-of-the-art system, you want to encourage artists to keep it as up-to-date as possible. Artwork moves around. Include loans and consignments. Database systems generally make this quite easy. If you can include information on sales, as I said, price realized, and current location of works, this can prove to be very valuable information. Reviewing this inventory with the artist is a valuable exercise in understanding that third pillar of practice and intent. Some of the most rewarding moments I've had working with artists is sitting beside them as we go through early work or student work and talking about how it has informed their practice and how it has brought them to where they are today. I believe Julia will probably be touching on oral histories in her presentation, which are a great addition to any legacy work. While creating or updating a database, I encourage artists to make sure physical works are labeled to match up to their entry and that work is signed. Your inventory numbering system can be very valuable in matching up work to inventory entry and to images on file. Number on an object, number on your database entry, number on your image file. Just make sure when you're putting numbers on artwork that you're doing so in a non-invasive archival method. And I'll add two, to look for discrepancies as you go along. Make sure titles, dates are correct, the title that the artist wants on the work, and that the spelling is all correct. And Kitai had the habit of changing titles over time. And we found it very valuable to have every title listed within our database with a notation on his preferred title. We've had, offers and inquiries about work where the title wasn't recognized. We recognized the image and we're able to pull it all together and then put out the title that the artist wanted. As you're confirming location and perhaps photographing work for the database system, it can also be an opportunity to make sure that artwork is properly housed and stored, and to discuss how storage will be handled in the future. One of the number one expenses is art storage for an estate. So does the studio belong to the artist? Will it be kept as a repository for the artist's estate to work out of? If it's rented or leased, or the plan is to sell the space, as was the case with Kitai, what steps can the artist take to ensure funds are available for proper art storage after they are gone? In an ideal situation, you want an heir to have easy access to all of this material and information, the what and where of the artist's holdings, and to have expenses for its care and storage covered within your estate plan. To me, this inventory is really the heart of your legacy plan and drives much of the decision-making that follows. So you have your inventory in hand. Now comes the really hard work, defining your priorities and categorizing work. We were lucky that Kitai had defined his 18 best works and designated them as to be left to his children. These works exemplified a capsule of Kitai's career, highlights, so to speak, and they were what he was most proud of. I met an artist recently who keeps a selection of every series he produces for his children, identifying and labeling them to clearly show these works are not for sale and who the designated recipient is. And I encourage artists to try to think this way. If you could only save a dozen pieces, what would you choose? This is extremely hard for some, but surprisingly easy for others. Alternatively, when that might seem overwhelming, I suggest an ABC approach. A's are the most definitely important work. B's are the tough ones that I'm not so sure. And C's, and there are always a few C's, are the, oh no, I don't need to keep that around. Invariably, we end up with a list heavy on the B's. And from here, I encourage artists to start thinking about what they can give away. Is there a local organization that they have close ties to that they would like to support? Are they well known for documenting their community and might have the local library interested in hanging a piece or two? Is there a museum that may be short on a certain area of work, but has heavy on the other side that they might want to augment? Are there grandchildren, friends, colleagues, students that may be thrilled to receive a work? There can be so much satisfaction in an artist being able to gift while they are alive. Of course, the tax benefits regarding gifting to nonprofits are different with living artists, and the benefit is only slight. I encourage them often to speak to their accountant or tax advisor and look into promised gift options that can lay the groundwork for an easy transition from studio to collection when the artist dies, and takes that burden off of the estate executors. With this, the list may start to shrink. Again, it is important to be reasonable. Many museums simply don't have the capacity to take on numerous gifts. By securing these opportunities while the artist is alive, you alleviate the burden on the heirs and that obligation to carry out estate directives that might just not be possible. And now your list is smaller. What remains? Consider how sales will be handled in the future. Does the artist have gallery representation? Do they want to continue and have the representation take on their estate? Does their contract already have a clause pertaining to their estate? What are the current terms and obligations to the gallery? What do you already have on consignment? And are there upcoming shows on the calendar? Kittai died in October of 2007 with a show in the works for Marlborough in New York for January of 2008. And so stacks of paintings were already in place that were ready to go off to New York. And it was important that we knew that that was happening. I encourage artists to think carefully about the relationships with galleries going forward. In that transition from living artist to estate, it may be an opportunity to reconsider representation. And if there is a foundation or nonprofit in the mix, there are pretty strict rules around representation and conflict of interest that should be discussed with a lawyer familiar with art and nonprofit law. All of these issues are very important considerations that should be discussed with legal counsel and included in the estate plan so that executor and heirs are aware of promises that have already been made. So what else can shape a legacy? What else is left behind? It is not just artwork that makes up your artist's estate. As mentioned, there are often stacks of paperwork, notes, source material, sketches, material samples, documentation of progress, exhibition announcements, correspondence with collectors, newspaper and magazine reviews, and so on. Kittai had been approached by the Smithsonian in 2000 to make a donation of his papers to their Archive of American Art, the world's preeminent and most widely used research center dedicated to collecting, preserving, and providing access to primary sources that document the history of the visual arts in America. He'd started the process with a gift of some minor ephemera, exhibition announcements, newspaper clippings, etc. But as Kittai became more connected to the community here in Los Angeles, he changed course. And today, the majority of Kittai's papers, ephemera, personal photographs, etc., are with UCLA Library's special collections. A gift made by the artist, and which included exhibitions from the collection as a celebration of this gift at UCLA and at the Skirball Cultural Center. Kittai's home and studio, as mentioned, were sold upon his death, and a destination for all the remaining possessions needed to be made. This UCLA gift continues as we continue to sort through his papers. The remainder of his archival holdings should all end up in the special collections. Now, with two entities holding his work, we've been able to work with UCLA and the American Archive to ensure their finding aids complement each other. We want to make these archives as easily accessible to scholars as possible. Looking forward, we are hopeful that this collection, which includes wonderful correspondence and archival photographs, will be digitized and made even more accessible. Right now, you need an appointment to access the UCLA collection and have a pretty clear idea of what you are looking for. This has really come to light during the pandemic of how difficult it is to access archives. So in an effort to promote the holdings, pre-pandemic, we also created a fellowship program with UCLA that invited an individual into the collection for 6 weeks and present on their experience. This opportunity came with funding and without any direction aside from instruction to use the Kittai papers. It can promote scholarship, it can promote creative writing, it can promote the creation of a new work of art. And at the end, we celebrate whatever that creation looks like, with this idea that it spurns new scholarship, new conversations around Kittai, and new ways of looking at his work. We were disappointed that UCLA was not able to take Kittai's extensive library. Kittai was a self-proclaimed bibliomaniac, and his home and studio were full of books, which more often than not informed his artwork. So after various conversations and deliberations, we decided to create an inventory of the hundreds of books and a photographic record of the shelves and piles that were everywhere, with the theory that it could be rebuilt, whether that's virtually or in any way in the future. The majority of the books ended up going to a private dealer in Bartley and were sold off to collectors around the world. We were pleased to know that his very specific collections, a collection of Judaica, a very extensive Cezanne publication collection, all went to individual collectors. We did hold on to some key texts, and we also held on to a collection of books that Kittai had received over the years through rights and reproduction requests to use images by Kittai on their covers. And we were able to take this collection and put it on view at the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam, which was a wish that Kittai had had during his lifetime that we were pleased to be able to fulfill. We did realize, though, that we do not have the storage space to keep this collection indefinitely and have begun the process of scanning the book covers so there exists a digital collection of this subset of his collection. We are grateful in the end to have this thorough inventory and location guide to the library, and this is another practice I encourage artists to take on. So as an active working studio at Kittai's time of death, there was also a lifetime collection of art supplies, easels, and furniture. And we were fortunate to find a home for his unused paints, brushes, paper, etc. We partnered with a local under-resourced university art program who established an award for a painting student to use Kittai's easel for their thesis work. So these gifts and endowments that are in place, further the legacy process. In some cases, an artist's archive may be the most valuable piece, as with conceptual artwork. With other artists, the archive may be limited to exhibition catalogs, reviews, correspondence, all in one box that could be of interest to an educational institution the artist was associated with. Still, other artists often say to me, I don't have an archive, and we have left it out of the plan. Although often as we're going through artwork, things will pop up and we'll try to include that in any digital file we've created. Artists are also frequently collectors of artwork by other artists in their circle, often procured through trade. This can be another interesting glimpse into the artist community and should be documented, though may or may not be of commercial value. And it is important to be clear that these artworks are not by the artist whose estate you were organized and not part of their owner. Often things are not labeled or signed, and working with the living artist is this opportunity to make sure these things are clearly defined. Gifts of these works by other artists from a personal collection also may have tax benefits, and it may be a good time during the lifetime to start deaccessioning. Understanding what an artist has held on to and how they've held on to it and how it supports their artistic intent always needs to be considered. So who are the people now with your plan in place who will help you realize these goals? Who do you want them to be? If a trust has been created, there will be a trustee or trustees, And there may also be an executor who is in place to oversee and carry out the directives in the will in its entirety. In other words, all the possessions, art related or not. The executor can be a lawyer, but is often a family member or close friend. The Joan Mitchell Foundation, in their extremely valuable, kind of the Bible of estate planning, the estate planning workbook for visual artists, adds a cultural executor to the mix. A term that when I learned about gave me an aha moment. Oh, that's me. That's what kit I had in mind. Often it is the studio manager or an heir that was particularly close to the artist's practice. It can also be a major collector or an associate with an understanding of the artist's oeuvre. It could be a graduate student who's gone on to work in the art world who is greatly influenced by their mentor. This was Kitai's intent in naming me, and I encourage artists to consider this addition to their plan. There's value in having someone who knows the work well, understands the relationship the artist may have had within the art world, and can help navigate as you push that legacy forward. A cultural executor or advisor is generally someone with the artist's practice in mind and put in charge of safeguarding the artist's legacy. They're familiar with the legacy plan, are brought in early so that they know what's going on and have the power to gift, sell, or loan work from the estate, as well as manage rights and reproductions. While the executor will have the overarching legal authority, this cultural executor really knows how to guide the legacy portion. They can make decisions about exhibitions, publications, might manage the website or social media. Two important aspects of helping to communicate legacy are those online components. And in many ways, they are the manager of the studio in its newest iteration, working with a finite body of work and looking for ways to keep people looking at it. It really comes down to how an artist wants to be remembered, coupled with peace of mind, leaving behind a well-organized, well-thought-out plan of action that is reasonable and responsible, again, those words that I'm always reminding myself of, and affordable, which can mean different things to different people. While the artist is living, have these conversations, because these are the issues that heirs will have to deal with. I'm including here a great list of resources. I haven't touched upon the option of creating an artist endowed foundation, which in itself can become a de facto kind of cultural advisor and carry forward the work of legacy. Or more in cases, there can be a timeline set with that, and the idea of sunsetting. So many considerations to be made around legacy planning. So many things to talk about. There are books and articles that can guide you there. And I know that my colleagues will also be filling in a lot of the blanks that I've left. I'll also put in a plug for a burgeoning Google group, the Artist Foundation and Estate Leaders List, which is open to individuals actively working with artist estates, and to which all the colleagues that I'm sharing these presentations with are members. And I hope you found this a useful introduction, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for your presentation. It was fascinating to learn more about the practical intricacies of legacies and estate planning. We do have a few questions, and once again, anybody else who would like to share their thoughts or anything that they'd like to discuss, please feel free to mention it in the chat. One of the questions we've received is, what's the biggest difference or concern with planning an estate for a living artist versus one that has already passed?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, really, for me, having the opportunity to engage the artist in the formation of the plan, I think that comes down to that pillar of intent. What did the artist want? And it can mean very different things for different artists. Coming into an estate that already is in place, hopefully comes with thorough instructions and access to those who may have been close to the artist during his lifetime that can help guide decision making, and again support that idea of artist intent. I'll add though too that considerations sometimes need to be made to go places where the artist may not have gone during their lifetime. For example, Kitai left us with a lot of prints and support material around his printmaking practice. And it was not work that he shared later in his career or talked about, but we decided it was an important part of his practice, working with his heirs and the executors, and were able to give a major gift to the British Museum and create a catalog raisonné of his prints, and look at them in a new way, which I think is something that he didn't have in mind during his lifetime, but I like to think that he would be happy to know that that's the direction we took.
Thank you. So one of the other questions is, what's the number one thing that you discuss with all artists in their estate or legacy planning process? The number one thing that they shouldn't miss?
Inventory. That list of what you have. And really, whether that's, a piece of paper, whatever that looks like, knowing what is in the estate. And it can be, an artist can decide to whittle that down beforehand and say, hey, these are the 12 or 20 works that I really feel are important and I want my estate to carry forward as my legacy. So having that core piece in place, to me, that's the building block that everything else comes after.
All right, thank you. Another question, you talked about going to see an attorney or tax advisor. Is there a best time to involve these professionals? Should it be after you've got a general plan in place, or should it be right from the start?
That's a good question. And I'm sure lawyers have an idea of this beyond what my thoughts are. I think if the earlier, the better in my experience. I don't think there's anything wrong with putting down ideas of what you want that you then take to a lawyer, but just to ensure that those pieces are in place and very clear, legal structure of how things will go forward, especially the funding piece. And again, those, reasonable and responsible words that I try to always carry in my pocket are ones that tax advisor can be very helpful with. And, we all think, oh, wouldn't it be great if I left all the work to this local museum? I'm just going to do that. But that may not be possible to carry out. So knowing those things early on can really help you strategize an effective plan. Again, that's reasonable and responsible.
Thank you. And there's another one. If no family is qualified to serve as a cultural trustee executor, where do you recommend looking for someone to serve?
I think if there's, a colleague or, like I said, maybe a past student or other person who's close to the practice. There's also, nonprofit and for-profit entities that exist. The Artist Legacy Foundation, which Julia works with and she'll presenting on, is an option. There are also a growing industry around this work and people who can come in as consultants and help guide and to do the work. Again, it all comes down to cost. I think that that needs to be a consideration and not end up being a burden on the heirs and the estate. So, it's looking at who is in that community. And traditionally, it is a paid position. Kitai did allocate funding to be available to support the work I do. And that's important to have that in place as well. So I think using the resources around you that you have and thinking about who knows the work, again, a collector or other resource too that you may already have a relationship with.
Thank you. Oh yeah, and we have one more. How do you have that hard conversation with artists that they can't realistically keep all their works after their death?
Oh, that's so hard. And sometimes it just doesn't move forward. And I think I'm constantly reminding people of their children and their grandchildren. And what do you want to have happen? Do you want them to have to make those hard decisions? Is there a way that you can help them now to know what you want? It can be overwhelming. I've seen with heirs, and nothing is more heartbreaking than having to get rid of work because you just can't reasonably afford to store it. I've worked with a family who did make those hard decisions, did their ABC list after the artist's death, took the A's and kept them in storage, were able to place a large chunk of the B's and frankly had to take the C's out. But it was emotionally very, very difficult. So I remind artists that that's a burden that you're placing on those who are left behind to care for your work. And as difficult as that conversation is, it's so important.
Thank you. We have got a couple of other questions. What do you think of the Clifford Still approach?
And I am not familiar with the Clifford Still approach. So I know that is it a sunset legacy? I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. He kept everything. Okay. Oh, and artists do. I think with a strategy that can generate income, Clifford Still, a name we know, might be feasible. Where does the burden lie in taking care of that work? Is there a gallery involved that is willing to carry that weight because they know that this artist is important and that they'll be able to generate revenue? It's a possibility. I tend to work often with artists who don't have great commercial success. And so those considerations are a little bit different. I think with Kitai, we were very fortunate. He'd been with one gallery all his career. And they did take on and held a lot of inventory. We made the difficult decision during the pandemic to terminate that relationship and revisit what our current holdings are. We called everything back into Los Angeles as an opportunity to really look at what we currently have and how we want to promote that much reduced body of work from what we had at Kitai's death. So Kitai had everything. There was a studio full of work going off to exhibition. So I would imagine the Still estate would be a similar situation to what we've gone through. Again, it's that commercial viability, which is, again, a tough conversation to have with an artist.
And we do have a participant asking whether you have any insight on the best places to store or best photographers or companies that would help with photographing. And
where you are, I ask everybody to please email me with any questions. If you go to the Kitai website, my contact information is all there, and there are referral lists available. Art storage, good proper art storage is very expensive, especially in major centers like New York and Los Angeles. And again, you need to make those hard decisions on the value of the work and insurance and all these things that can come into play that I didn't go into. Like I said, with this artist whose work was not commercially successful and didn't leave an estate plan, his family member decided, to just rent a storage unit, carefully pack everything, wrap it in plastic so that it's safe from possible leaks, and hope that everything was okay. So, it really depends on what your resources are. I know artists who have worked with graduate students who help with inventory, can do photography. Again, it depends on the budget of what you're able to do and how creative you want to be in realizing your plan.
Okay, there were also a couple of other questions, but I think a few of them regarding the 6-week fellowship and maybe information on developing a sliding scale and trade for estate plans. As you said, if we'll be able to share your contact information, then all of the participants, they can get in touch. And if there are any other questions that you have, then Tracy has nicely welcomed us to email her with them. But for now, if there are any other thoughts that anyone would like to share at this point, or we can let Tracy go. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. It was super informative. This is an area that I also don't know much about. So I know, especially as an international law student, this was a really great session, and I'm
Oh,
sure all the other participants felt the same.
thank you. It brings me great joy to be able to share lessons learned and continue Kitai's legacy in this way. And I love being part of this community. I think that there's exciting work happening. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And thank you to all of the participants for your questions and for the discussion. We hope to see you next Thursday for our conversation with Julia, and the following Thursday with our conversation with Chelsea. Thank you.